Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of Vocal Europe. I'm Caroline Herlin. I'm an EU policy researcher of Vocal Europe, and I'm honored to be moderating this event today, which will be recorded and published on our website and on social media platform. The discussion we'll have today will focus on the cooperation between the EU and Eastern Partnership countries in security and defense policy, with a focus on associated countries, which are Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. This topic has become very relevant today as the war in Ukraine represents the culmination of Russia's aggressive strategy in Eastern Europe since the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and sheds new light on the vulnerability of post-Soviet countries to Russia's aggressive tactics. For the EU, instability and the spread of Russian influence in the region challenges the EU's Eastern Partnership goals of promoting democracy, good governance, and a rule of law. Therefore, guaranteeing security in its eastern neighbourhood is very much tied to the member states' own security. As Mr. Joseph Borrell stated, Ukraine's security will be our security. And despite substantial political and financial investment in the EaP region, which surpasses that of the US, the EU remains largely marginalized as a security actor in its own neighborhood. Therefore, boosting security and defense cooperation with Eastern partners is essential to the EU's ambition of achieving strategic autonomy, and is also set out in the EU's 2021 strategic compass. To achieve greater stability and security in its eastern neighborhood, the EU needs to step up its security commitments vis-à-vis EaP countries and help them become more capable and responsible managers of their own shared security. The EU and the so-called associated trio already cooperate closely in multiple security areas, but in today's webinar, we'll discuss what the future cooperation between the so-called EaP3 countries and the EU will look like. And our speakers will help us do just that. I will now briefly present our speakers. First of all, we have Dr. Cornelia Kakacha, who hopefully will be joining us soon. Mr. Kakacha is director of the Georgian Institute of Politics, professor of political science, and Jean Monnet chair at Tbilisi State University in Georgia. His current research focuses on Georgian domestic and foreign policy and security issues of the wider Black Sea region. Secondly, we have Dr. Vadim Pistrinchuk, who also will be joining us later. Mr. Pistrinchuk is the founder of the Institute for Strategic Initiatives of Moldova. He's a former member of Parliament of the Republic of Moldova, former researcher of the European Council on Foreign Relations. We'll also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Gustav Gressel, Senior Policy Fellow with the Wider Europe Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Berlin office. Before joining ECFR, Mr. Gressel worked as a desk officer for international security policy and strategy in the Bureau for Security Policy of the Austrian Ministry of Defense from 2006 to 2014. Mr. Gressel has widely written on a topic we'll be discussing today. Next, we have Dr. Susan Stewart, who is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and focuses on Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy and EU-Russian relations. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Edward Auer, who is head of division at the External Action Service, responsible for the Eastern Partnership regional programs OSCE division, who shall contribute to the technical side of this division. So Dr. Tracy German and Mrs. Mariam Grugashvili will unfortunately not join us today for cause of illness. But thank you all for contributing to this webinar. This is certainly a very diverse panel, and I'm sure this discussion will be very interesting and insightful. We will now start with Mr. Auer, who will give us the perspective of the EEAS and give us some insights into the current state of defense and security cooperation between the EU and associated EaP countries. Mr. Auer, my first question to you is, what are the specific areas of cooperation between the EU and Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia in the security and defense sphere. Over to you. Oh, my apologies, you are muted.
Just before my clarification, before I start, I see 4 people in this call at the moment, Ms. Stewart, Mr. Gressel, yourself, and me. Are there any other people linked to this, or is it just the 4 of us?
So Dr. Kekasha will hopefully join us soon.
Okay, but there are no outside listeners except from the 4 that I've just mentioned.
For now, yes, but hopefully 2 other people will be joining us a bit later.
Okay, good. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So my first question is, what are the specific areas of cooperation between the EU and Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia in the sphere of security and defense?
Okay, good. Now, on I think the most important is certainly Ukraine. Yet the EU has made an exceptional effort since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine. We provided, I think the official figure is about 23 billion euros in total for support. This included 3.1 billion of military support. And on top of that, we estimate that member states bilaterally spent about 11 billion euros to help people fleeing the war. So this is a very substantial contribution. And it's not only, of course, as we know, financial support, but also very importantly, military hardware and very essential military hardware. Only recently, the EU adopted the macro-financial assistance for Ukraine for next year, for 2023. That's, I think, another 18 billion euros. So we are involved with Ukraine in a very, very substantial way and intend to stay with Ukraine. Important to note that it's the first time that EU finances delivery of weapons to a country under military aggression. The European Peace Facility probably was not in, the people who created the EPF did not have this situation in mind. But it was put to good use in this situation. I think out of the sum that I mentioned earlier, 3.1 billion came from this source. The total of the support is, of course, considerably higher. Military support, because much of that was provided by member states from the national resources and the national hardware capacity. We have in the meantime also established a military assistance mission that will provide collective and specialized training to Ukraine soldiers, and the first batch of 15,000 Ukraine soldiers are already trained. The concerns both recruits and professionals whose skills will be upgraded. Very important also, of course, the candidate status that was granted to Ukraine and Moldova, and the European perspective that was granted to Georgia. In a holistic view, that's also a very important contribution to the resilience, stability, and security of these countries. Important also, I think, to mention the regional perspective. The Eastern Partnership as our regional policy was the region, was of course under needed to redefine, because with the candidate status, the European perspective, there's an important new element and new needs for cooperation with these countries. On the other hand, Belarus, the officials are not invited to Eastern Partnership anymore. And so there's a need to have an Eastern Partnership where we still can bring in Belarus civil society. And Armenia and Azerbaijan have chosen not to go down the European path, which is perfectly fine, of course, but we need to have a special formula then for them. that's, I think, all that I need to say as an introductory statement. Thank you.
Thank you. I have further questions to ask you. Have you seen an evolution in the progression of a cooperation between the associated countries and the EU? Has it increased from 2020 to up until now? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
With the European perspective for three of the associated countries, that's clearly a very clear development. An intensification of cooperation, and we see that certainly Ukraine authorities are very committed to work on this accession path, on this bilateral accession path, and they take the priorities that were included in the decision for their award of candidate status very seriously. They really make an effort there, as does Moldova, of course. Personally, I'm more in touch with Ukraine, so I can say this from personal experience, but I have the impression the same is very much true for Moldova. For Armenia, Azerbaijan, I mean, the big development this year, of course, is the role that the President of the European Council, Michel, played in the mediation of the border conflict. So yes, there's been definitely a development.
Thank you. Could you tell us a bit more about what current provisions are in place for cooperation between? Let's start with Georgia first. So, what has cooperation between Georgia and the EU in secure defense looked like so far? In different areas, maybe you could maybe start with the CSDP and the training of armed forces experts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion going on this. I don't think I should talk too much about this at this stage.
All right. So maybe one last question: do you see differences between Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova in terms of commitment? So, in terms of the intensity of cooperation that has been occurring in the past years?
That's a very good question. The conclusions of the General Affairs Council that took place a few days ago said that the Commission will make its assessment as part of the regular enlargement package in autumn 2023. There will be an interim assessment in spring, and the declaration that the Commission attached to the conclusion, I think, said that this will be an oral presentation. I think then we will know more about this question, but it's indeed a very, very relevant question, but difficult to say at the moment.
Thank you. One last question. So cooperation is certainly not a one-way street. Could you tell us a bit about how the EaP countries, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, have contributed to the EU? So how did this cooperation benefit the EU in the CSDP, for example?
They contributed, for example, before the war already, contributed, I think, contingents to CFSP missions. And they aligned to some of our declarations, although the CFSP declaration, although the record was different from country to country and different from subject to subject. So these are two issues that come to mind.
Thank you very much. I see that Dr. Kornelij Kakaja has not joined yet, so I will go over to Dr. Gressel. I would like to talk a little bit about the European Peace Facility, which is a €5 billion fund, which aims to strengthen the capacities of third states and finance CSDP missions. And the European Peace Facility was dubbed to be a game changer by Joseph Borrell. Is this really the case? And can the instrument really make a difference and allow the EU to step up its strategic involvement in the Eastern Partnership region and in security and defense matters?
Well, yes, it is. Although it started very small, so it was a very controversial instrument when it was created in very late 2020, and it started sort of the 2021 budget was very small, limited to non-lethal military aid, mine clearing, military medics, etc., everything that all member states felt comfortable with, but it was stepped up significantly after February 24th. So then basically the instrument actually came to being, and a lot of especially the new equipment that is now supplied to Ukraine, especially in the field of air defense, while of course the member states are putting their flag on it and are very proud to deliver it. Most of that is financed via the European Peace Facility that now for Ukraine alone is 3.1 billion euros already spent on lethal aid. That's quite a significant number compared with where we were prior to the war, when this was a terribly slow and painful discussion about every item and inch that would be delivered to Ukraine. So certainly, yes, it is coming up to speed. The EPF is also active in Moldova. Moldova has the problem that it had basically neglected the defense field. It thought that Ukraine would be a significant buffer between them and Russia. So unlike Georgia and Ukraine, Moldovan defense budget was low, despite which government was in place, whether you had a progressive one or a pro-Russian one. They both basically thought that diplomacy and neutrality would get them through it. Now EPF is also helping them, but the problem is now, of course, with Moldova, you really have to start from scratch. In Ukraine, Europeans can make use of a lot of previous bilateral cooperation by member states, by also allied partners. There's intensive military presence was there by defense attaches, by trainers in Ukraine, because of course, not EU, but still EU member states like the Baltic countries, Poland had a common sort of a Lithuanian, Polish, Ukrainian brigade where you had common comrades, you had the NATO trust funds, you have the multinational training initiative. So all these are, of course, corners and experiences you can build on. In Moldova, you pretty much have to start from scratch. In Moldova now, France is actually quite active now. The French have one battalion in the NATO forward presence in Romania, and they're using this forward presence in Romania to also train with Moldovans to also provide a lot of bilateral assistance to the Moldovan military. So this is also getting up to gears. It's of course not strictly EU, but it's a significant EU member state that takes care of these issues. Georgia, as said, is a bit of sort of the problem candidate right now. I mean, on paper, the Georgian armed forces are the most progressed when it comes to implementing NATO standards. But the problem I try to tell these bureaucrats time and again, that NATO standards alone don't make a good army. Ukrainians were quite far away from NATO standards, but they're still very good and capable army. So people often unfortunately confuse the two. The problem, of course, with Georgia is the macro-political situation. So on paper, you have an army that is very much interoperable with most of the European armed forces. You have also the Georgian armed forces having the longest history of contributing both to NATO missions and to EU missions. You have them actively in Kosovo engaged. You have them in Mali at quite significant numbers, by the way. So especially those professional soldiers who are used with international missions, they have a long track record of working with European states. The problem, of course, is that the macro-political situation in Georgia, the issue of state capture, the issue of abuse of state institutions like the Georgian intelligence service that has been used to provide intelligence information to the Georgian Green Party for the election campaign, also that has eavesdropped on EU representation, on the bilateral representations with many EU member states in order to improve the Georgian bargaining situation in bilateral negotiations. That is considered a serious foul by the EU institutions as well as most member states. And that has poisoned the trust and the working relationship that with the Georgian government. And this is something that can only be resolved by sort of high-level political dialogue and engagement to squeeze the Georgian government back into the reform track by, I think, the 12 demands that are put up in Georgia. They should be supervised very thoroughly and not kind of grant Georgia a sort of geopolitical benevolence. On other EU support, the EU advisory mission, UAM in Kiev, actually is sort of now forgotten, but also a very, very important instrument. It was there for civilian security sector reform. And at the beginning of the war, it started to reinvent itself to sort of provide liaison and connect intelligence services from EU member states to the Ukrainian ones, and to kind of facilitate cooperation in this field and this sort of counter subversion intelligence on Russian activities is an enormously important battlefield. And a lot of sort of, especially Moldova, looks with quite some envy on the EU advisory missions. They would like to have such a mission as well in Chisinau, not only because of the practical cooperation now, but because of course, now looking into the acquis that they have to implement also in the civilian security sector, as they basically have neglected this field in all the years before. They would really like to have a permanent representation on advice on all these reform steps, because this is simply put over sort of the bureaucratic aspect alone is overwhelming the government capabilities in Moldova. It's still a very small country, very small bureaucracy. And every bureaucrat has now a very tall tale of legal, bureaucratic, procedural reform issues that they should tackle. So that's certainly something the EU could have a look into. And I think I'm pretty much done with my first remarks.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer. I would like to question you about Moldova a bit further. Moldova has experienced relentless cyber attacks targeting its government, and the biggest one taking place quite recently. Do you think Moldova is better prepared against these attacks, and in what shape should more cooperation be implemented between the EU and Moldova?
Yeah, well, the cyber front, despite you don't hear or read so much about, the cyber front has been enormously active since the outbreak of full-scale war in Ukraine. Ukraine as well has been a considerable target of Russian cyber attacks all the time. The advantage Ukraine has is that it has a bigger IT industry, a more muscular IT security sector. In Moldova, this is sort of the first Sandu government, so 2019, trying to at least on paper start to create cybersecurity institutions like cyber incident response teams, etc., to kind of mirror the European standard and practices. But these institutions were very new, were sort of still are in their kind of tooling phase, and of course they don't have such a huge wing of voluntaries and private sector assistance that the Ukrainians have. So the vulnerability on the cyber field was much more felt in Moldova, because the defense capabilities you have at hand in Chisinau are not as high as in Kiev. They turned to European assistance for that, particularly, of course, EU member states that are very well experienced with cyber attacks, Estonia, for example. They also turned to help from European institutions. There was a bit of a tussle before the candidacy status, because EU cybersecurity institutions do not have a mandate to engage beyond the borders of the EU. I think now these bureaucratic hurdles are a bit diminished by Ukraine and Moldova having candidacy status, and it's sort of easier for them to work with a candidate country than to have just an associated partner. But the problem is I'm not a cyber guy, and a lot of this stuff happens basically behind closed doors and without public attention. So I can't comment all too deep into that. But there is EU assistance, and there is bilateral assistance from EU member states quite significantly in Chisinau to kind of stem the tide of attacks.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned that it was easier for the EU to work with candidate state with countries that have candidate status. This is a question that I would like to ask Mr. Auer. Now that Ukraine and Moldova have gained candidate status, will we see more cooperation and assistance from the EU in security and defense? Oh, Mr. Auer, you are muted, I'm sorry.
It's an important part of accession negotiations, of course, but I don't think I should comment beyond that at this stage.
Thank you. All right, I will go over to, oh, actually, I have another question to you, Mr. Gressel. Many commentators have stated that Ukraine was vastly unprepared for a war with Russia. And from the start of the war, it seems the EU is trying to catch up with assistance to Ukraine it hasn't provided in previous years. With support from the EPS and the recently launched EU military assistance mission. In an article you wrote with Mr. Nicu Popescu before the war, you put forward the idea that the EU should build bilateral security compacts with associated Eastern Partnership countries. Can you explain the rationale between this idea and explain if such a measure would help catch up on the time that has been lost and help Eastern Partnership countries further?
Yeah, so that was basically an idea Nico and I cooked up during I think it came up in a 2018 trip to the front line of the Donbass. We were, of course, at unease with the war situation. We thought that this will not stay as it is. We were called warmongers and Russophobes back then, but that's part of the game. Also, of course, this was a paper that was born out of the experience with the Trump years. The predominant security provider through all these years was the United States, and security not only because of the 75 Javelin launches the Americans provided that initially started training with these anti-tank missiles. This American security and then British security assistance was much larger because of the intelligence cooperation, because of the training, the military training Americans, Brits, Poles, Balts gave to Ukrainian armed forces, the assistance in doctrine, etc. The common maneuvers they had, particularly the British, but also the Americans in Ukraine with Ukrainian forces, all to prepare Ukraine for bigger contingencies we thought that might lie ahead. We thought that basically Russia was preparing for another war. And we of course sense that the American bureaucracy, the Department of Defense, intelligence community, State Department, was very much up to task, but there was an American president, Mr. Trump, that was not up to task, and and we saw all the scandals and that basically he tried to abuse that for private purposes and ditched Ukraine into the American domestic politics in a very nasty way. And we thought, well, if this goes bad, and if this continues to do so, Ukraine will be in a huge trouble because the Russians will take note and will conceive their own measures for that. So how could the Europeans help out? How could the Europeans take over? What could the Europeans do? And we tried to scale up the things that Europe could do from soft security assistance training maneuvers, and then kind of work our way through to hardware support, trying to point the Europeans that Ukrainians are handling a lot of military equipment where the ammunition and key spare parts are only produced in the Russian Federation, so they don't get it. So sooner or later, they will have to transit from Soviet equipment to Western style equipment. And we should help them with that. Now, of course, all that has been accelerated because look at air defense, S-300 and Buk missiles. Ukrainians, of course, shoot now much more of these missiles per day than during peacetime. Of course, we see it with artillery ammunition. We will see it with tank ammunition in a couple of months when Ukraine will be in a dire and desperate need for Western tanks because Soviet-type tank ammunition is gone. And we can't produce it at the pace Ukraine needs that. All these are things that we tried to put on in the political spotlight back then. They are still relevant as of now. Of course, now we are talking about a much more accelerated pace because we are now in the full-scale war that we tried to prevent and deter by advocating bigger defense support to Ukraine. I think if all these measures that are implemented now would have been implemented during peacetime, we would not have gone into this war, and Putin would not have conducted this full-scale war. But in most capitals, the logic of appeasement prevailed at the time, and people thought we should not provoke Russia by supplying arms to Ukraine. And we face, of course, now the consequence of pacifism.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Mrs. Stewart now. So Mr. Gressel has talked a little bit about the security needs, security defense needs of Ukraine currently. Could you please expand a little bit on that and maybe talk about the security needs of Ukraine in the longer term, maybe after the war ends? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think that actually Mr. Auer has outlined quite well the sort of assistance, and I do think that it corresponds to current Ukrainian needs in large part. I would maybe emphasize a couple of points. I mean, first, that this European peace facility, as I understand, has now been topped up by an extra 2 billion for 2023, which I think is very important to mention also in the context of what Gustav was saying in terms of this having been a relatively limited pool of money before. I think about 5.6 billion, of which, as was stated, 3.1 billion has already gone to Ukraine for lethal weapons. So I think this topping up is important and corresponds to what we see Ukraine needing going forward, because clearly, as I think we all have experienced in the Ukrainian discourse, the emphasis is still put on arms deliveries of various kinds. And then another point I wanted to make in terms of corresponding to Ukrainian needs, perhaps, let's say, in the field of economic security, because even though the arms deliveries are sort of in the first place for the Ukrainian side, we know that this macroeconomic stability is really key in terms of keeping the state functioning and having this sort of background against which the war can continue to be pursued effectively and efficiently. So there, I think these 18 billion that Mr. Auer mentioned are extremely important, because what we've heard from Ukraine in the past months is the need to have not only sort of a certain sum, but the clarity that this is going to be dispensed regularly. And I mean, the intention is to have it every month, 1.5 billion over the course of the next year. And as we saw last year, Ukraine had to resort essentially to printing money, which of course resulted in some inflation during the summer, because they had counted on money that had been promised but was not immediately forthcoming. So I think in that sense also, I mean, this corresponds really to what Ukraine needs now. And then maybe looking a bit further, I mean, with regard to security and sort of in a wider definition, I mean, we talked a bit about the idea of repair and reconstruction. But I think this platform that is now going to emerge under the G7 format, but with a Commission Secretariat, the European Commission Secretariat, coordinating the process, I think is extremely important, and also shows the enhanced role of the EU, but also the need to think in these broader formats where it's about this larger sort of security environment where the EU is a part, NATO is a part, the G7 is a part. So all of these actors, I think, are going to play important roles, and the ways in which they interact is going to be really important, especially because at the beginning, I think, Ms. Herlin, you mentioned that our security will be, that Ukraine's security will be our security, but that the opposite is also true. Our security will be Ukraine's security. And that's why I think it's very interesting. One of the questions you posed in the invitation to the event was whether this has actually, the war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and the Ukrainian response has been a wake-up call for the EU in terms of security and defense. And that's where I'm not certain that it's really the case. I mean, it may be sort of sitting here in the German context that it seems to be less so the case. But it seems that these questions of, say, EU cooperation with NATO, these kind of coordination issues are still very difficult, and the whole question of European strategitic autonomy versus the NATO framework, I think one needs to look perhaps more in a more intensive way for kind of compromises or solutions which are not simply sort of in the NATO framework or simply pursuing a European strategic autonomy, but combining the two. So maybe I can stop there for the moment, but that's a kind of a longer term challenge that I see. Maybe just one more point on that, because I think what we need now, what this war has revealed, is that we are going to have to come up with security formats and a European security architecture that does not include Russia, and that in fact sort of provides security against Russia for the time being. At least that's my projection, that it's not going to be possible anytime soon to work with Russia in the security environment, even if Vladimir Putin has to leave power. So I would say that we need more formats in which the EU, not only the EU, but also the EU discusses internally these questions of developing such a security architecture, but also with the countries that we've been talking about, with the countries of the trio, and in fact with the Western Balkan countries as well. I mean, some countries, some questions may be needed to discuss within a sort of EU trio format, others within EU Western Balkans, and others much more broadly. And here, I mean, also relating to the point that I said about thinking broadly in terms of various frameworks, we can also think about to what extent the European political community, which has just been created and which is still, I mean, still kind of relatively unclear what sort of role it could play, but whether it could be a sort of platform for discussing these broader questions of European security.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. These were very interesting points. I would like to ask Mr. Auer and Mr. Gressel, what are your thoughts on what Mr. Stewart has just said? Is the war in Ukraine a wake-up call for European defense, and with regards to its ambition to achieve strategic autonomy and becoming a holistic security provider in the region? Is it time for the EU to step up its capacities?
Who first?
Pardon me?
Who first?
Oh, whoever wants to jump in first.
I think these were very important points that Ms. Stewart made. The EU has certainly reacted very rapidly and effectively to the developing crisis, Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And indeed, all the discussions that she mentions are underway and are very important. It's probably a bit too early to talk about conclusions of where these discussions are going, but I fully agree with all the issues that she pointed out and the things that need to be discussed.
Thank you, Mr. Auer. Mr. Grethel, any thoughts?
Well, on the post-war security arrangement, the thing is, the most important outcome that will shape Europe for the next decades is the outcome of this war. And I think too much thought is given about the post-war situation and too few thoughts about how to shape the outcome of this war. If Ukraine ends up with a Minsk III agreement, which is something that some people in a lot of Western European capitals still think is advisable, and especially the White House, Biden thinks that is still the only thing feasible, then we are in big trouble, because we will have a Ukraine that is split in two by a contact line that is where a significant portion of its cities or of its inlet waterways, of its key transport infrastructure will be under occupation, where very few Ukrainians will have the feeling that this war has ended, but rather that another Minsk agreement or whatever you call the ceasefire agreement has just provided a pause in the fighting, about war will commence in 5 years or in 3 years. And the problem is then you will have a demographically depleted Ukraine, because a lot of people will not return who have made it to foreign countries now. You will have a Ukraine where private investors won't come. You can throw some developmental money into that, but people will try to invest that into their flats in Vienna or in Berlin or what elsewhere as soon as possible, because they have no confidence that at home things will stay as they are. And that will be a very, very tricky and dangerous situation, because such a weakened Ukraine, of course, will further embolden Russian further military aggression and kind of make this, especially if you add on top some domestic policy scandals or corruption issues that always might pop up one time or another, and lead to some sort of disillusionment in Brussels, in Europe. So this will be a highly dangerous situation, one we can only avert if we do not only support Ukraine to just survive the war, but to win the war, and to induce a defeat on Russia, a defeat that is undeniable for the Russian political elite at home. Only such a defeat will deter Russia from trying this in a couple of years. Only such a defeat will induce self-confidence into the Ukrainians that whatever the hardship during the war, whatever the destruction caused now, they have made their mark in history, and they can now rebuild their country. So instead of promising another billion in terms of long-term reconstruction aid, I would very much be happy if we would invest this money in tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and all the bad offensive weapons that we are depriving the Ukrainians for now, in order for Ukraine to achieve a sustainable peace, because this investment will return X-fold in the post-war situation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stewart, would you like to react?
Yes. I mean, I agree with much of that. I agree that a Minsk III situation is definitely not the way to go, and that we need a more decisive, clear sort of defeat of Russia and victory by Ukraine in order to get a new situation in which this kind of European security order that I was talking about can actually emerge. But one danger that I see, if you look back at the previous years, is that by not having these discussions and not really coming up with clear policies. I mean, if you look at the policies toward Russia on the EU level, we did have basically sort of the formats and that had been created prior to 2014 were largely suspended, and then the so-called 5 principles emerged in order to deal with Russia, but they were rather general, and it was not really a sort of coherent and fleshed out policy framework, but sort of a kind of the best that the EU could do in the situation. And for instance, in Germany, there was actually no policy. There was simply a kind of a crisis management mode that was entered into. And I think the danger of being in this crisis management mode is that it allows those actors who prefer to think, okay, this is a temporary situation. Right now we're dealing with this crisis, but we have a kind of a previous policy. We can go back to at least elements of that afterwards. So I think making it clear that actually this is not what's going to happen, and that we're entering into a completely new era, and having discussions about what that era could look like is important, and can make actually a contribution to making sure that it's not a Minsk III agreement that happens, but something more decisive. And maybe one point on indeed it's necessary to think about in the context of the war, and sort of more immediately, is the question of Crimea, because I believe that Crimea is going to become kind of the sticking point, where it's going to be, I mean, assuming that the Ukrainian army is able to continue to make inroads and to gain back territory, and assuming that the Russian armed forces are not able to kind of make a comeback, then at some point we will be confronted with the question of whether Ukraine attempts to retake Crimea. And that's where I see a lot of potential opposition coming from Western capitals about that, because that's where what Gustav was talking about enters in, this kind of desire to compromise, to find a sort of some kind of compromise along some sort of contact line, which would then just postpone further fighting, probably to a later stage.
Right. Thank you very much. I would like to switch the topic towards, so after the war ends, what lessons can the EU and Ukraine draw from this cooperation that they've established? So what can the EU learn from the Ukrainian experience on the battlefield to strengthen its capabilities in the future? And can it learn from this experience to respond to various aspects of contemporary conflict in its neighborhood? And what would be the implications for the EU's tool to counter hybrid and conventional threats, to build up its resilience? We can maybe start with you, Mrs. Stewart.
Okay, yes, I think that's a very important point, because it is important to start thinking about how we can learn from Ukraine. I think that it's been out there a bit in the debate, but the emphasis has certainly been much more on how can we assist Ukraine. And I think that once Ukraine is in the EU, it's going to be an incredible partner in terms of security and defense, because of the experiences that it's gone through. On the other hand, it's going to also be a challenge because of those experiences, because it will be a very different type of European, EU member state, from others that may actually have had some experience with violence and with fighting in the past, but not nearly as recently as is the case in Ukraine. So on the question of sort of learning, definitely there will be the possibility to learn about sort of questions that arise in terms of fighting on the battlefield, but also, like you mentioned, and like we were talking about a bit before, the fields of cyber and cybersecurity and disinformation. I think there it's definitely a two-way street, because on the one hand, Ukraine now has a lot of experience with this, certainly the EU as well. I mean, the EU member states, many of them have been subject to cyber attacks and certainly to disinformation, coming from Russia, coming as well from China. But this is also a possibility, I think, in terms of engaging with Ukraine and how it deals with these attacks and this disinformation, to learn and how to respond. I mean, to come up with new instruments, but also to raise questions, because sometimes the Ukrainian response is not necessarily compatible with, say, EU requirements. I mean, there have been questions raised, for example, with regard to how the Ukrainian government has dealt with the media. Sometimes that has been sort of presented as the need to fight disinformation. There's the question of prohibiting certain opposition parties. I'm not passing a judgment here on whether or not these actions have been proper or not. But I think they need to be part of the conversation with the EU in terms of making Ukraine compatible in the process, in the accession process. And so this is an opportunity for learning on the EU side, but also for this kind of two-way street about how to actually deal with such threats. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gressel, would you like to react? Is the Ukrainian experience a learning opportunity for the EU, especially in the area of cybersecurity? What are your thoughts?
Well, as I'm sort of the military specialist in the room, of course, I could talk quite endlessly about the war. I think it will be very much studied by military analysts for the coming years. First of all, because, of course, we face the same enemy. It's the same Russia that threatens the eastern flank. And I fear it's a Russia that will, beyond the war, continue as an authoritarian, imperialist, fascist state, and as such pose threats to us. Of course, the war has gone through various iterations. And I think whatever we might meet in NATO will rather look like the first phase of this war than the current phase. But still, we have a lot of lessons that we can digest, and I think some of them are actually already painfully obvious for us to learn. The first of is you go to war with the army you have, not the army your white book talks about. Ukraine, just like any other European state, has very nicely written white books about defense modernization and how the Ukrainian army should look in by 2035 and what it should all have, etc. But the war happened in 2022, and it happened at the worst state for the Ukrainian army. But where they actually were in transition into different modes of how they operate. And that is a lesson, you know. We also write a lot of fancy strategic compasses and strategic concepts and white books and non-papers, etc. But, you know, crisis and war breaks out when we didn't expect them and when it's the worst for us. The second thing is total defense works. You see that in the Ukrainian case. We have some countries, especially in Scandinavia and the Baltic countries, where they have experienced total defense. Other countries don't. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from that. However, of course, every society is different. Ukrainian way of doing total defense looks different from Finnish ways of doing total defense, because the Ukrainian society is a different one than the Finnish one. But of course, there are commonalities and there are common lessons in how to organize, how to relate on certain organizations and structures in the times of war. The third lesson is that war is a mess, and war is never how you intended and planned it to come about and to do that. And the more flexible, the more decentralized your structures are, the more capable they are to cope with the mess, because the mess will be so overwhelming that centrally coordinating and sort of top to bottom saying people what to do in the mess will just not work. It will overwhelm any command and control structure wherever you are. And that is an important lesson. I mean, decentralization reform was probably the most important war contribution of the European Union before the war, before the EPF, because it enabled local governmental structures to react to this onslaught and humanitarian crisis that the war has invoked on a much better level than they would have been capable of doing before the war. And we should sort of looking at our governmental structures and how we prepare our defense structures, etc. We can take a lot of lessons from that. Of course, we have very different administrative, bureaucratic traditions, depending on which member states we talk about. So we have to translate and transcend that this Ukrainian experience into very different traditions across Europe. But I think it's a very important lesson that we should have in mind.
Thank you very much. These were very good points. Mr. Auer, would you like to add to what Mr. Gressel has just said? Pardon me, you are muted again.
Sorry. No, I'm not a military expert, so I really can't comment on questions of what military conclusions to draw from this development. I've just been called away to another meeting, so unfortunately I have to leave you now. Thank you very much for the discussion, and I'm sure we will see each other in other venues at some point. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mr. Auer. All right, Mr. Stewart, would you like to add or comment on what Mr. Gressel has just said?
No, I'm also not a military expert, so I think it's more sort of our points perhaps complemented each other. But I did find very interesting that point about decentralization as a contribution to the war effort. I mean, it's certainly been important in the Ukrainian context in a variety of ways, and it's interesting to see that also for the war effort, it's been actually of key importance, which of course was not foreseen when it was undertaken and when the EU put so much emphasis on that and invested in it to such an extent.
Thank you. I have another question to ask you, Mr. Stewart. So how can the EU further assist Ukraine under wartime circumstances, but also at the same time, how can Ukraine continue its internal transformation that is necessary to pursue future EU membership? How can we reconcile the two?
Well, in terms of how it can be assisted, I think we've talked about a lot of instruments, and I think that needs to be continued and potentially if where at all possible intensified, especially, I mean, as Gustav has emphasized, regarding the war front, because it is indeed essential for Ukraine to be victorious in this war in order to get a fundamentally new situation on the European continent, one in which Russia can be contained and dealt with in a very in a much more decisive manner than up until now. I mean, regarding the Ukrainian internal transition process, that's an enormous topic. Obviously, it's difficult to keep up the reform process and still pursue the war. Nonetheless, Ukraine has been managing to do that. We see that a lot of laws are being passed to conform to the EU conditions, particularly the 7 steps that were outlined that Ukraine needs to conform to in order to pursue its, in order to enter into the formal negotiation process and open up the negotiations on the various chapters. So that is going on very intensively. At the same time, because of the war situation, there are a lot of questions of transparency, of capacity, and so on that arise. I mean, some of them were present before, but now we're seeing them in a heightened fashion. And then the second point is maybe that I mentioned that a lot of laws are being passed. That also we have had in the past, but the question is about implementation. So I think really the fundamental question is about Ukraine managing to emerge from the war with the potential to create to undergo essentially systemic change, right? To move away from this oligarchic system that was present before to another system of governance. And what we see as a result of the war is that the oligarchs are severely weakened. So there is the potential for this to happen. But we also see, I mean, number one, very strong centralization of most processes, which is, I think, perhaps normal for wartime, but would need to then be phased out and allow for a more decentralized approach after the war. And it's a huge question as to whether those actors who are benefiting from this centralization will be interested in doing that. And then also the idea that I mean, that the oligarchs could come back, because this is a model that has been very entrenched and many people have benefited from this. And this is a model that many people have in their heads when it comes to governance in Ukraine. So there we have a lot of open questions about whether this type of systemic change is going to be possible and to take place in a post-war environment. And there, I think also the fact that Ukraine is involved in the EU accession process means that the EU will have a significant amount of leverage on whether that happens, but will also need to be incredibly involved in monitoring and seeing what processes are actually occurring and in which direction they are leading. Together with as was the case before the support of Ukrainian civil society, which has been unbelievably active. I mean, in every situation, in the reform context before the war, in the war effort, and then certainly after the war, and even now in the question of this transition.
Thank you. Mr. Gressel, would you like to add to this, or if not, we'll switch to another topic?
Well, I second a lot of what Susan said before. I think the war has fundamentally reshaped the political economy of Ukraine's domestic system. Now, whether there will be independent institutions that will fill the oligarchic vacuum that has been created by that is something that is still out there. It could happen. It also could go wrong. This will depend how energetic the EU fights for institutional reform here, or at least that will be a part of it. I just hope we learned our lessons from previous rounds, where, for example, especially in judiciary reform, the commission was and particularly Mrs. Matanova was particularly keen to applaud the formal adaptation of judiciary reform steps without looking behind the curtain, whether the vetting process was sound, whether the judges vetted actually have a proper record, etc. Because we have now institutionally entrenched a lot of old people that we are probably never going to get rid of, and that even if you look at the administrative court of Kiev are posing problems right as we talk. So I hope that in the next phase we will be more clever and more intelligent in supporting Ukrainian reform.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to talk a little bit about intelligence. As I think you've mentioned, you've made a couple of points about that in the beginning of this webinar. As we said, Russia is increasingly using hybrid warfare tactics to pursue its goals, such as espionage, subversion, disinformation. And I can argue that developing the intelligence sectors of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine is just as important as providing military aid. In the field of counterintelligence and intelligence sharing, how can cooperation be further facilitated, and are there obstacles to cooperation between intelligence agencies in Georgia and in Moldova, for example, and EU member states? Thank you. I think we'll start with you, Mr. Gressel.
Yeah, I think that's more for Gustav.
Okay, well, it's also a vast topic. So for the obstacles, I already mentioned one in Georgia. That is, of course, political. The the political abuse of the Georgian intelligence service, the state capture by Georgian Green Party and by Mr. Ivanishvili, who is basically abusing state structures to his own political and private wealth goals. That is putting up severe obstacles in cooperation with the entire security sector, both police, domestic security, but also, of course, intelligence, cyber. In Moldova, things are better because of the overall better rule of law situation. The problem is, of course, there is the issue of capabilities. You have to invest a long time into capability, in increasing capabilities, both in terms of human resources, which is difficult in many post-Soviet countries, as the formal salaries, for example, of employees of the intelligence services is not very high, and that increases the incentives for people to have, let me say, side earnings, down to the problem of continuation, institutional continuation. Those capable cyber intelligence guys in a country with strong competition from a strongly emerging cyber industry, you really have to pay them to keep them, because otherwise they will be hired by local companies to do coding and to do analysis, etc., because they get much more money for that, to use their skills. The other thing is the whole issue of competences of administrative law. The Soviet Union had, as a tradition, a very opaque procedural laws when it comes to investigations, overlapping competences, in order to instate the Communist Party as the arbiter between institutions to solve institutional conflicts day and again, that basically the system has programmed into it in order to keep party control over the institutions. And this legacy is haunting all post-Soviet states. None of them is basically an exception to that. And to cure that, it requires long work and very, very deep knowledge of the local administrative laws and procedures. So you need to establish contacts with local people. You need to sort of have a permanent presence on the ground. It's very hard to judge all these procedural issues if you sit in Brussels and just read reports. To liaise with civil society, with watchdogs, with local intelligence agencies. Not all of them are crooks and bad. A lot of them really want to do reforms on their own, but you really have to sit there and see who is the good guy, who is the bad guy, with whom you can work and not. All that is a very labor-intensive work that needs to commence over years. If you see in Ukraine, SBU reform, I mean, now it's paused because of the war, how long the struggle for SBU reform took, and we're still not, the sort of reforms are created on law, but not in reality. Basically, the institution tries to dodge reforms wherever it comes to their own bureaucratic turf. So this is something you really have a very long stamina institutionally. And you need knowledge and people on the ground to really do that. Once you start on that, and once you enter into cooperation, it's actually a very, very good thing. We see that in Ukraine now. Not only that intelligence cooperation actually is working, we also get a lot of hints from the Ukrainians on things that we can incorporate in our own to-do list. Which brings me to the second issue. We talk a lot about intelligence reform in the Eastern neighborhood countries and the associated countries. And yes, there's a lot to do there. But we also have tremendous amount of homework in our own countries. And now the new special representative for sanctions implementation, that's an enormously important job, because sanctions are only as good as they're implemented and supervised. And we are not in the best shape to do that. Then if you see, for example, fighting or confiscating oligarchic assets and hidden money, the two most successful countries by very far margins are Spain and Italy. And you will ask why? Because they, of course, have the institutional knowledge to fight organized crime and money laundering from their counter-mafia fight. I would love to see the Guardia di Finanza, supervised by the Milan General Prosecutor's Office, to come to Berlin and have a look at the Russian swamp here, or to Vienna and have a look at the Russian swamp there, because these people who really know their stuff will find things that the Germans and the Austrians probably never have thought about. Which brings me to the next problem. There's a huge disparity in capabilities of European member states to bring their own house in order. Some countries that have been previously occupied have basically no proper intelligence capability on their own. I'm talking about Germany and Austria here. Very weak financial intelligence, very weak banking supervision. The Wirecard scandal in Germany was not yet a wake-up call for Germany to get its institutional house and anti-corruption fight in order. We see the scandal in the European Parliament. A lot of the illicit money by Russian intelligence, but also by local criminals and oligarchs, is laundered through EU countries, through banking systems in the EU, through our real estate market. It's not only London and it's not only the Cayman Islands, it's also Vienna. It is Munich, it is Berlin. And that is a huge problem, not only for our credibility, but for the practical nature of this fight. And there is a very long to-do list for ourselves in that.
Thank you, Mr. Gressel. Mrs. Stewart, would you like to react in any way?
Well, I don't have that many points to make on this topic, but I would maybe go back for one moment to the Ukrainian case, because I think that what we saw there is also the penetration of the security and intelligence services by the Russians, right? Before the war, I mean, even after 2014 and the beginning of the reform processes, this remained a very serious problem, and we saw the impact of it toward the beginning of the war. For example, one reason that Russia was so easily able to take Kherson was because of basically traitors within the ranks of the intelligence services. And I mean, let's hope that the war is sort of working to purge this phenomenon and to get rid of those people who are now more sought and easily more identified, and are also flee on their own, say, together with Russian forces. But that also impacted on, I mean, this cooperation with the US that Gustav mentioned, because you don't want to pass on intelligence information to a service that you feel is then penetrated by the enemy, basically. So this is crucial, and also as was mentioned, the overall reform of the security service of Ukraine. And even more broadly, I mean, going beyond the field of intelligence, the entire field of law enforcement, the Interior Ministry has never undergone a serious reform. Basically, there were sort of piecemeal reforms, like in parts regarding the patrol police and so on, which were in part quite successful, but they were not then followed up by a sort of more encompassing reform of the Interior Ministry, and then this question of the security service, which has very, very wide-ranging competences, which open doors for corruption, essentially. So this is a huge field which really needs to be tackled, and which I believe that the EU advisory mentioned that was mentioned before. I mean, prior to the war, it tackled certain problems, but there were other problems that were simply kind of closed off, where there was simply too much opposition from the Ukrainian side to allow the EU to make any kind of inroads there. And the hope would be that, I mean, after the war, we will have a different environment, but also because of the EU accession process, more will be possible in that framework.
Thank you. I have another question, maybe on the broader side. Can EU security and defense assistance to Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine be an incentive to pursue reforms, not necessarily in the intelligence sector, but in terms of the rule of law and corruption? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yes, of course. I mean, and we have to be stringent on that. First of all, defense and security assistance is something that you earn by making a European choice. And this earning incorporates not only a pro verba commitment to norms and procedures and values, but also a commitment in doing so. I mean, look at the Georgian case. The kind of all these state capture corruption issues that we see with the current Georgian government, they contradict their proclaimed Euro-Atlantic values and aspirations. And you have to tell them, look, guys, if you want to go to the EU, and we are happy to help you out with your big, scary northern neighbor, but this is not a free lunch. You make your own choice to be European, then you have to behave that way. In Moldova, I think they are now in a better shape because they have lived through this struggle in a bit more open and brutal way with past governments, and also because Moldova was the place where the European Union learned that they should not support anybody who just puts a European flag on their political party and pretends to be pro-European while they actually aren't, like Mr. Filat. On the other hand, a support in institutional reform, anti-corruption, civil society, etc., is futile if you do not care for security. Russia perceives military and security threats as its key advantage, where it can outpace the Europeans, who arguably have more economic power and more attractive soft power. So wherever you bump into the hinderness of a more attractive EU, let the tanks roll. So we have to care for the tanks. We have to care for security. But of course, as a part of a general pro-European orientation of a country that manifests itself by behaving in a certain way, by reforming in a certain way, by having limits, by having checks and balances, by having rule of law. And we have to be crystal clear about that.
Thank you very much. Any thoughts from you, Mrs. Stewart?
Yes, I mean, while I agree with that, I think we can't really talk about these questions without introducing the role of NATO, because it's clear that I think, as you said, Ms. Herlin, in the beginning, that the EU has not been a sort of very strong actor in the security and defense field. So these countries have turned more to NATO. Okay, not Moldova, which still professes neutrality. But as we know, Ukraine and Georgia wanted to join NATO and were denied the membership action plan in 2008, and nonetheless pursued the process of becoming closer to NATO, and obviously Ukraine is very strongly now pursuing a NATO membership. So I think that one needs to at least mention that I mean, when thinking about the EU, so far it hasn't been so much about these security and defense questions and what the EU can provide before the war started, but more about questions of simply prosperity, right? More economic integration, economic benefits, but also the rule of law questions, especially for large parts of civil society and for those people who wanted to see also large parts of Ukrainian society. I'm talking about the Ukrainian case. That wanted to have corruption rooted out and so on. They looked to the EU for this sort of to kind of help deliver this together with their own efforts. So I think when talking about the security and defense question and what sort of how much conditionality this can generate, I think it's necessary to take into account the role that NATO plays in the thinking of these countries in that field.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from you, Mr. Gressel? Otherwise, I think we'll switch to one last question I would like to ask. Anything to add?
No, nothing to add. It's good.
So one last topic that I would like to ask you, Mr. Gressel. I would like to discuss participation of Eastern Partnership countries in PESCO as a result of the 2020 Council decision. Third countries are now permitted to participate in PESCO projects, and I would like to know where do you see this going? Which particular projects do you see Georgia and Moldova join? Which domain would be most beneficial for each of these countries?
Yeah, thanks. Well, the Eastern Partnership countries have been long in fighting for joining PESCO because they didn't know what it was all about. If I'm to put it bluntly, the problem is the PESCO projects are basically entrenched cooperation projects that happen between neighboring countries anyway, and that just have been given the name of PESCO for the sake of giving it a name. They are very much tailored to needs, none of which fit the needs of the Eastern Partnership countries. So I don't know of any practical value of this, and I don't know of any practical participation. This was kind of sort of the typical you want to be part of because you want to be part of. We have a bit of a problem. We had a problem. For example, Ukraine had a capable defense industry, and European defense industry tried to shut it out from the common European defense market as much as possible because it was perceived as a threat. Antonov was building transport aircraft, so was Airbus. They were building armored vehicles, so did various other European enterprises, etc. Well, now the war has come and Russian missiles have destroyed most of Ukraine's defense industry. So we'll see whether in the post-war situation, PESCO will be an instrument suitable for rebuilding that sector. For now, we see basically Poland recruiting Ukrainian technicians on the border to sort of set up production facilities specifically for Ukrainian defense needs to produce ammunition spare parts for vehicles Ukraine is operating. That is a very good initiative. It's basically something the Poles have set up unilaterally. If the Commission has some money to spend on that, I would happily recommend them doing so. But I don't know if that should be or could be labeled PESCO for bureaucratic reasons, but it needs to be done.
Hello, Mr. Pistunchuk. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes,
Hello.
I can hear you. I'm very sorry for being late, but there were two conflicting events, so I just ran away.
That's all right.
Probably it's too late already, but at least to greet you all.
I would be happy to hear your thoughts, but if Mr. Gressel and Mrs. Stewart want to leave at the time that it was at past, please feel free. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Pistunchuk. I would like to ask your thoughts.
Hi, Gustav. How are you?
Oh.
Thanks a lot. Coping with crazy Berlin.
I'm coping with crazy Chisinau. Come here, visit us.
I will. But don't worry.
Right. Yes, I would like to get your thoughts, Mr. Pistunchuk, about Moldova, and in particular about which area of defense and security policy should be a priority for cooperation with the EU. We've seen that Moldova has cooperates with the EU in multiple areas, and we've seen resistance as well. Which area do you think is a priority going forward?
Well, if Gustav already said his word, I know that he knows very well our gaps in our security and defense, and I'm sure he made already the introduction, but risking to repeat maybe. First thing, of course, Moldova didn't pay too much attention to its security and defense policy in the last 3 decades by emphasizing the neutrality. Now, for the first time in our history, the neutrality is widely discussed as being incapable of delivering security because of the war in Ukraine. And of course, people started discussing and analyzing that our defense capabilities are very small and weak. Certain things have been done in that period of time, like cooperation with our neighbors, drills that will imply not only the national army but other forces that can play a role in case of deterrence or war. But I would say that there are few things that the EU should be doing in that sense. First, you should redefine its support towards functional defense policy in the Republic of Moldova, or countries like Moldova, which is its neighborhood, eastern neighborhood. Why? Because a lot of calls before the war, a lot of calls about the neutrality and keeping neutrality always, how to say, intangible, came also from the EU. I think that now this perspective should be changed, and you should even ask government and put a bit of pressure that on revising its defense policies. The second priority should be, of course, assisting, supporting countries to fight efficiently against the hybrid threats. We are discussing very long time about that, but still governments are not, and I see the same trend actually in Moldova, Georgia. Governments still do not apply proactive measures in countering some of the hybrid manifestations of the hybrid warfare. We're still somehow balancing in between. Something has been done in terms of countering disinformation, but in terms of cutting the operations in the territory of the dependent sovereign state that are performed by another state, in this case Russia, we still have very big gaps, legal and operational and even political. Next, one more important thing is, of course, the informational and ideological policy, which is very important. In countries like Moldova, in general, the subjects of defense policies, of security, they are always somehow has been seen through the neutrality classes, which appear to be a fake representation about security in the current world. And very often the messages encouraging Moldova of keeping the balance and discussions with Russia on the subject, for example, of Transnistria, were coming from your EU as well. And that was a misleading position, as we see now, because all these games in, let's give even more neutrality. We are neutral by constitution, but we could, for example, hear from representatives of European Parliament or some parties, or EU representatives within OSCE, calls to Moldova that we should be even more neutral. Maybe we need another legislation, piece of legislation that will describe the neutrality. So in that sense, the EU also can change its rhetorics and communication on the subject of defense policies in the Eastern Partnership countries, because the EU is a very trustful communicator nowadays. And if the sign will come from EU, message will come from EU, it will be much easier undertaken by the society. It will be clear that this is a trend in entire Europe, and it's not only a political desire of our actors. And the third point would be, support, active, proactive support. Is in case of Moldova, proactive support in tackling the energy warfare, because, for example, we were talking about weaponizing and militarizing the energy by Russians for years, last 15 years at least, but we were not taking too serious. Very important energy infrastructure projects have been delayed and being implemented now. This is about connecting Moldova to energy sources in Romania, electricity and gas. But now, for example, if we speak about the entire Europe is facing an energy crisis and explosion of prices. But what we experience here is absolutely unsuitable to the size of our economy at the national level and absolutely unsuitable and comparable to the size of the household budgets. So, and it's not even a secret that Russia is doing that in order to block economic Moldova and to, how to say, discredit any political power and to create social unrest and overthrow the government. So that's the plan. Because the prices for energy in Moldova are unsuitable to the size of the economy and the household budget. So we need the support of the EU in that sense, because there are no alternative. Some support is in place, but still, for example, the calculation of the government that Moldova need like €1 billion only for this year to survive the energy crisis. I think that we got almost half of it, $1 billion, from which half should be at least grants. So we don't have these amounts. There were 3 conferences organized, 3 conferences on donor support organized, one in Bucharest, Berlin, and Paris, as I know. A lot of money have been raised, but still far from the target that is needed. So now the government applied some extensive national emergency policies compensating population. But this is how to say, this is very large-scale intervention of the state, but that will weaken the state for the next year in terms of social security, economic security, and as a consequence in the overall security and military security as well. So we will not be so much able to invest in defense. This year, for the first time in the history of Moldova, the budget of the Ministry of Defense has been increased 20 times or something like that. Of course, it's an important thing, but you can imagine that the size of our economy, it means very little. So direct military cooperation with our neighbors, especially in terms of air defense, which is unaffordable for Moldova. And we already experiencing the missiles which cross accidentally or not accidentally the air of Moldova. That will be also one of the priorities. So that's being short. And once again, I'm very sorry for being late. But this is the period with a lot of events, conferences, and final reports.
Indeed, December is always very busy. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Piszczynczuk. I think we'll be ending this webinar. I would like to thank Mr. Gresson and Mrs. Stewart for sticking with me through this hour-and-a-half discussion. We've heard very interesting points and insights into what the future of security defense cooperation of associated EaP countries might look like. We've also touched upon where the priorities lie in terms of security, the security needs of the so-called associated trio, and what benefits this cooperation would offer the EU. Again, to remind all of you, this discussion will be available on all of our social media platforms and on our website. Thank you all again. Thank you all 3 of you again for joining us this morning, and I wish you a lovely rest of the day. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.